Wanted to take a look at SPY stock today. We're already seeing some selling going into the week. We've got a big week. Inflation numbers come out tomorrow, Tuesday. Then we get PPI numbers coming out again on Thursday. And you will recall last month's number, we saw a surprise pop higher in PPI. Now the producer price index it's a small percentage of what consumers will actually see once those cost increases pass through. It will take some time to see those cost increases pass through. Nonetheless, the market is a little jittery this week to start off. SPY stock today down about a half a percentage at one point. Let's jump in. I want to show you some charts that I'm looking at, especially non-farm payrolls from Friday, and then a look at what we could see going into this week and how important this week is for SPY stock. Let's jump in. Non-farm payrolls for last week, we did, and I have some charts I'll show you. We did see some revisions downward in non-farm payrolls being created for the month, and that was something I've kind of quipped about earlier, that we always see revisions. We don't know if they're going to be up or down, but a revision is almost an absolute certainty. This time, the revisions downward were a little bit like, wow, okay. But I do have a breakdown of what's going on with that. At the same time, NVIDIA sold off Friday. And NVIDIA stock, for me, is overpriced, regardless of what's going on. And because the Magnificent Seven represents such a big portion of the, say, SPY stock, when you see one of these big players selling off, it really affects the whole sort of psyche of the market. From the non-farm payrolls number, we did see Treasury yields initially spike, fall. Now they're kind of trending back upward modestly. We're really waiting on tomorrow's number. Again, inflation numbers. Now we get two inflation numbers, the consumer price index and then the PCE index. CPI comes out, I guess, about the second week of the month. PCE comes out the last week of the month. PCE is the one that the Federal Reserve watches. CPI and PCE kind of go hand in hand. There's really very modest variations between the two. So the CPI gives us a pretty good heads up of what the PCE will tell us at the end of the month. So we rarely get too many surprises out of PCE. That's why CPI is so important. Taking a look at non-farm payrolls, there were revisions lower for the previous 2 months. Pretty solid number, 275 for increases in non-farm payrolls. We're pretty steadily right where in a range that the economy is growing. Given the revisions downward in non-farm payrolls, we're growing, just not as rapidly as a pace previous. But it's not, we had a pretty big run up in interest rates from the Federal Reserve. And we expected that we would get really close to zero growth in non-farm payrolls, if not negative. We never saw that. So it really became sort of a flyby when it comes to the slowing down of the economy, despite the Federal Reserve having raised interest rates as much as they did. While the Federal Reserve did raise interest rates, the federal government did provide stimulus in the form of the anti-inflation bill, whatever they called it, they passed. And that helped prop up the economy overall. A big chunk of the inflation we saw, 70% of the inflation spike we saw was housing. So the increase in interest rates affected mortgages, obviously, but it really didn't necessarily dent too deeply the overall economy. Here are two charts, civilian labor force and number of unemployed. Whereas last month we saw a big drop in the number of unemployed, this month we saw a big spike. If you average them out, it's average. Civilian labor force, this is the total number of individuals who are considered in working, and that turns into the unemployment rate. So we did see a kind of a jump there. I think 3.85 was roughly the number, rounded up to 3.9, and people jumped on that. But overall, we're mostly running at an average level. None of these numbers are really showing that the economy is slowing down. We're at 3.85% unemployment rate. If we crossed 5-6%, that would be an economy that's slowing down. We're nowhere near those levels. And if the economy were to continue to move forward as it is, the Federal Reserve really wouldn't have any kind of argument to say we need to lower interest rates. But if the unemployment rate were to continue higher, if the civilian labor force were to stall out, people gave up on wanting jobs, and the number of unemployed continued to trickle higher, which from seasonality numbers, December, you're going to see some kind of moves higher, that would affect the Federal Reserve. But I don't think that this number really kind of did push the needle one way or the other for the Federal Reserve to make any kind of decisions. We're fairly status quo. Here's one thing that I keep looking at, and I'm just like, this is impossible to me. The numbers you're seeing here, this is about 25% of SPY stock. All right, the holdings. And as you can see, these are the biggest holdings. And you really got to kind of ask yourself the question, these companies right here, when you walk around on a daily basis, sure, we've got our iPhones in our pockets. But outside of that, do they represent 25% of your expenditures every day? Breaking all these down, showing you where they were. This is the close of Friday, of course. We've seen NVIDIA sell off kind of sharply on Friday, and this really affected everything across the board. Regardless, you're seeing about a total of about 3.2% in future yield for just one share of each of these companies. Some of these stocks, like Google, very underpriced relative to, say, the 10-year Treasury yield. The rest of them are overpriced, but Apple getting closer and closer. Amazon stock, 2.3%. Meta Platforms is right about wheelhouse right there. But then you have Microsoft and NVIDIA. Regardless of the future growth, these stocks are overpriced relatively. And this prices in future earnings. So investors, although we keep hitting, say, SPY stock today, hitting a new all-time high, getting to the point where it's like, well, how much is left in the tank? And my basic take on this is not a whole lot more. While individually there may be some stocks that are undervalued, mostly speaking, the 25% of SPY stock is overpriced. And because of that, you're seeing players taking profits. Here's a breakdown of all 11 sectors. I have SPY stock at the very top, QQQ stock, of course, the NASDAQ version of it. Then there's the 11 sectors of the S&P 500 broken down, kind of give you a good idea as to the future yield. Now, future yield doesn't necessarily mean price increases. But when you take a look at the biggest value investor there is Warren Buffett. He sold some Apple holdings. The guy's got about $165 billion in cash that he's put into treasury yields, which are yielding about 4.2%. Apple stock, of course, is 3.8%? He took that money out of Apple stock, instead of dumping his cash, pushed into oil companies. Now, those oil stocks are not necessarily moving higher. In fact, the price of oil today is moving lower. But that shows you that these prices for that Magnificent Seven that represent 25% of the overall stock market, the biggest value investor is tapping out. Here's a look at SPY stock. This was Friday. Initially, on the news for non-farm payrolls, of course, sold off. Then they started looking underneath the hood, rallied. NVIDIA selling off, pulled the rest of SPY stock lower. And that was kind of status quo for the day. We're moving sideways to downward for SPY stock today. It's Monday about Mountain Time, roughly 9 a.m. here, so 11 o'clock in New York. We're down about 0.35% on SPY stock today so far. We're really going to be waiting. We'll probably finish up roughly at that price by the end of the day because we're really waiting on what's going to happen tomorrow with inflation numbers. U.S. Treasury yields trending slightly higher. And I thought that was a little bit weird, but at the same time, I think the market realizes that tomorrow's number might not be as low as they want. And that's really going to start spooking the U.S. 10-year Treasury yield, and we could see the 10-year Treasury yield moving back upward. We're right around 4.1% right now on the U.S. 10-year Treasury. I could see 4.15, 4.2% by the end of this week, and we're really just going to sort of hang out right in this level. There isn't necessarily enough information right now to really push the 10-year yield much higher or much lower. That does not mean that the SPY stock is necessarily going to sell off, simply because given the current interest rates, there isn't really, this is neither necessarily accommodative nor too restrictive for the economy. So if the U.S. 10-year Treasury does sort of park right around 4.25 for a period of time, maybe 3, 4, 5 months, this economy will continue to perform. And that's something that kind of may push the needle for SPY stock back upward. This is where I start all my analysis, personal incomes, and I wanted to kind of show this one more time. Whatever I'm looking at for inflation or any of those kinds of numbers, I first start with personal incomes. Incomes really drives the future year-over-year changes for consumption, which then turns into inflation. Keep in mind, inflation and jobs are lagging indicators. And as we see personal incomes continue to increase and expenditures on a year-over-year basis continue to increase, the eventuality is employment and inflation will start to trend a little bit higher. And that's what I'm really focusing on. So tomorrow's number could be really important for the future if we see a move that is unexpected. Nonetheless, I wanted to kind of break down SPY stock today and show you what happened for last week, what to expect this week. I expect we'll probably see the U.S. 10-year Treasury pop a little bit higher. SPY stock probably trends slightly lower, but there's still a lot there on an individual basis for some stocks to kind of start buying on the dips. The move in NVIDIA coupled with Apple could really be detrimental for SPY stock overall because it represents so much of SPY stock. Make sure to hit that like and follow button if this is the kind of content you're looking for. See you in the next video.